Okay.
So in few seconds we can start.
Okay.
Good evening to everyone, and welcome to the final lecture of the series organized within the workshop Landscape of Limits, which was promoted by the Master of Sciences, Landscape Architecture and Sustainable Architecture and Landscape Design within the School of Architecture of Politecnico di Milano, Campus Piacenza. Tonight, I have to say I'm very pleased and excited, I must admit, to introduce James Corner. I know very well that James Corner does not really need an introduction, since he is one of the main protagonists of the world's contemporary landscape architecture scene. Just few elements. Is a designer, founder and director of James Corner Field Operation based in New York. It is impressive to scroll through the list of projects, which includes really a lot of works, like the High Line, the probably most well-known, but also Fresh Hills Park, Staten Island, the Ray Street Pier in Philadelphia, and a lot of other really important and interesting works. Awards, exhibition, lectures all over the world, and then his highly influential writings together with his works offer since year a fundamental contribution in the debate about landscape and urban transformation. It is probably this question, the relation between landscape architecture and urban design at a different scale from the large one until the human one, the main field operation, it is the name of the studio, a key word to define Corner's approach to design. Because it's his design and construction work with complex and intertwined soft natural systems based on ecological communities and hydrological patterns. In this way, the potential scenarios for the site are forecast to explore the multiple processes at play across the wider area. The ultimate aim is an active landscape that repairs and improves what are frequently ravaged natural systems, but, and this is really a very important contribution, with an eye to drawing and meaningful and often poetic landscape design. And this is very important since in the contemporary urban situation is becoming more and more evident that design of landscape in parallel with infrastructure and ecology is deeply necessary for triggering the reconstructuring process in contemporary city. To use the words of our guest, he wrote in Recovered Landscape, very important to say, Corner advocates a recovery of landscape based on the yet to be disclosed potentials of landscape ideas and practices. To quickly get to a conclusion, let us try to rethink what we, especially in Italy, have learned from the works and writings of James Corner. I would like to try to sketch a list, short and probably incomplete, as Valerio Morabito, who has greatly contributed to the success of our invitation to James Corner observed in the last days. Anyway, I dare to do it. First, I think we have learned to understand the massive complexity of the world that we live in, which is not so obvious in designing. Second, to work collaboratively with other disciplines, multidisciplinary approach is quite central, to produce solutions that are respectful to sites and to inhabitants. Third, I think also to create new urban spaces that contribute to the wider natural and cultural territory, but above all to implement the potential to take a poetic measure of environmental processes. So on the behalf of the School of Architecture of Politecnico di Milano, I think that our Dean Ilaria Valente and our Vice Rector Emilio Faroldi are probably present in our virtual room. I would therefore like to thank James Corner for having accepted our invitation tonight, and I give him directly the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is indeed a great pleasure. I'm going to try and see if I can pull up my screen. Is this working? Could somebody just let me know if you can see?
Yes,
this?
it works. It works.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is a great pleasure, a great honor. I love Milan. I love Italy. And I love my good friend, Valerio Morabito, who invited me and helped to organize this. Valerio is a wonderful friend and colleague. He's an important teacher and professional. And I miss him. I haven't seen you, Valerio, in quite some time. I hope to be able to see you soon. I thought that in preparing a presentation for you today, it's almost impossible to do so without thinking about the situation that we are in 2020. And in a sense, it demands a sort of a repositioning in terms of what we do as architects, as urban designers and planners and landscape architects, a sort of a repositioning as to how we work and how we think and what we do. I will get to that in a minute because I wanted to just begin very, very quickly, but with a survey of what you would think field operations has been doing. You know, I hope, that we work on fairly big and complex and transformative projects. The High Line in London, the London Olympic Park, the Seattle waterfront. Our projects work with nature and ecology and environment, helping to bring green and nature and sustainable systems into the city. And we design essentially for people, for the theatricality of people being able to simply be amongst other people in public space. You know, of course, the High Line, a landmark project, a wonderful garden in the sky, a promenade, in contrast to the urban fabric and the urban streets. But the High Line has precipitated new buildings, new development, new economic investment on the west side of Manhattan. And it's really designed as a beautiful stroll, a promenade, a series of gardens and plantings, and a series of windows and theatrical platforms where people can really just sort of enjoy the drama of being in the city with other people in the context of New York. There's artwork and very, very small details where the details become very important. You may know our project in Domino, a waterfront park. It's just been built and it's opened. It's a magnificent new waterfront park tied to new urban development. But here we retained a lot of the industrial artifacts of the site to create a sense of place and to retain a sense of authentic experience, the authenticity of these old industrial sites on the river being retrofitted for new social life and new urban lifestyles on the river in the park. And you probably know our project in Tongva Park, Santa Monica, with these great viewing pavilions and quiet gardens with a beautiful horticultural palette in terms of a series of gardens, or the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in London, or Navy Pier, Chicago, or Presidio in San Francisco, more recently, waterfront in Hong Kong, magnificent new retrofitted esplanade, a wonderful public promenade where people can display themselves. We designed this so that it rolls. It has a rolling profile where the profile of the esplanade rolls up and down and looks across the harbor to the skyline of Hong Kong. With 10 million people a year visiting this place and bringing new gardens and new planting, a new horticulture to an area that previously had no green and no public open space on the harbor. In China, in Shenzhen, we have this park, a new central park, very, very green, with new paths and plantings, viewing pavilions, new theatrical performance spaces, and a beautiful green park with places for discovery and for play and for families. And of course, you probably know our master plan for Shanghai, a new city organized around green open spaces, functioning ecosystems, new waterways, and it's under construction as we speak, with these big new green urban parks being created, with new landform, new terraces, and gardens and plantings. And finally, a project we're currently wrapping up in the West Bund Arts waterfront with new spectacular experiences along the water. Now, I moved through those slides fairly quickly because they paint a picture of projects that you're probably very familiar with. They are placemaking projects where design is very important, and the poetics of material and craft and detail and the iconography of design becomes foregrounded. But in 2020, there needs to be more, and we need to be thinking about how our skills with design can go a little further. It goes without saying that planet Earth is under incredible stress. We're seeing this with significant climate change around the world. And in an interesting newspaper article in the New York Times a few years ago, there was this essay called "How We Broke the World." It begins with the World Trade Towers in 2001, the economic crash of 2008, the current pandemic that we have, ongoing climate change issues. And one of the quotes in the piece is that over the past 20 years, we've been steadily removing man-made and natural buffers, redundancies, regulations, and norms that provide resilience and protection when big systems, be they ecological, geopolitical, or financial, get stressed. We've been recklessly removing these buffers out of an obsession with short-term efficiency and growth without thinking at all. At the same time, we've been behaving in extreme ways, pushing against and breaching common sense political, financial, and planetary boundaries. Now, I find this very inspiring and very important that we try to come to terms with where we have been societally and globally over the past 20 years, and how we can make cities and places that we design more than simply beautiful places, but also places that are really doing things ecologically, environmentally, socially, culturally, and politically. And so towards those ends, I want to share two projects. One is, we call it the South Bay Sponge. This is all about San Francisco's bay. You can see here the Pacific Ocean, San Francisco in the middle, and then the big body of water in the middle is San Francisco's bay. And the bay is surrounded by significant urban development, many, many communities, tens of millions of people. The bay itself is subject to significant flooding through sea level rise, but also climate change. And many of the communities that are impacted are poor, disadvantaged neighborhoods, very poor and disadvantaged communities. And it's not only the flooding, there are also so many problems here with transportation, with overbuilding, with unaffordable housing, and with challenges for new development in a challenging environmental context. Many different types of community, many complex challenges around the bay. This picture was taken yesterday of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, with hillsides on fire from wildfire. The sky is literally orange for hundreds of miles around, with many communities struggling with basic air quality given the smoke. So when we looked at this, we thought that there needs to be three big initiatives. The first is more nature. Let's try to find space for natural systems. The second is more connectivity. Let's try to improve transportation and connectivity amongst communities. And thirdly, let's look at building new communities, new development, where we can actually have more affordable housing and enhance the development quality of life. So it leads to a massive regional approach, saying more nature, more connectivity, more community. And we looked at a number of local situations around the bay. We called them bay towns. And we began by looking at edges, because edges is where you have land, water interface. We then looked at what we call sponges. These are absorbent landscapes that can absorb life and storm and weather. We looked at corridors, these are transportation corridors and development corridors. And we looked at what we call hubs. Hubs is where you would concentrate transportation with dense forms of urban redevelopment. So it's a landscape and an ecological approach combined with an urban design and an urban planning approach. And that these systems together could create a kind of a catalog for how we work with different edges, different landscapes, different corridors, and different types of development hub. So one of the places we looked at was San Rafael today, and the flood threat in the next few decades. And these are some images of what San Rafael looks like. A lot of challenges with infrastructure, low-lying conditions. And so what we propose is a new edge with a new sort of sponge landscape, a number of absorptive landscapes inside the town, which allows us to project a new development plan, which will bring new building, new housing, new economic development, as well as significant new landscapes and new parkland and new infrastructure. In Oakland, a very similar situation with low-lying communities. Some of the pictures of Oakland. And again, a similar strategic approach to how we would work with flooding by redesigning edges and aligning new development alongside new landscapes. And again, producing a new kind of scheme. A third area is Mission Creek in the center of San Francisco, subject to significant flooding. And again, something about the character of this place. And again, a strategic approach to how through landscape infrastructure, we could build a protective environment that also allows for new economic development, new housing, new communities, new transportation, integrated with new ecological landscapes. And finally, what is called South Bay. This is where Silicon Valley is. But it's also where you have billionaires living just half a mile away from some of the poorest people in San Francisco. This is a massive area subject to a lot of challenges, not only flooding, but also transportation and development challenges. Look at the density of the building there compared to the wetlands and the bay. Well, all of that area is subject to significant flooding projected for 2050, with not only flooding, but also erosion and damage to infrastructure. So we have a series of studies here that have to do with the levees, with the streams and the creeks, with the various salt ponds, the various flood basins, and so on. And then we develop a strategy and we say, look, this is the water's edge today. If we don't do anything, all of that will be underwater. So what we want to do is to build a new absorptive landscape, a sponge landscape that would function like a sponge, where nature itself becomes an ecological system. We begin with what we call the soil swap. The soil swap is literally digging soil out of the marshes to build higher ground for new development. And we identify a number of sites where this can happen and show how you can ecological landscapes as well as redevelopment landscape. Hello, I think there's some background noise. No?
No, not now. You can go on.
Okay. And secondly, the land use swap. This is where we densify building. So instead of large footprint buildings that cover a lot of area, we build in a more dense and a more compact manner, and thereby opening up landscape that can be part of the new ecological system. So, without going into too much detail, you can see a strategy here, a landscape strategy that allows for urbanization and for development, but also accommodates and builds new landscapes to work with issues around climate change, flooding, and the environment. The third strategy is the sponge itself, building extensive new kinds of wetland. And you can see in this diagram bringing some of that inland too, to work with some of the streams that have flooding challenges too. These are the creeks essentially, and the sectional profile of that. And then this produces this vision for a new landscape, a new sponge-like absorptive landscape working with creeks and the bay, while at the same time building new land for new, more compact forms of mixed urban development, new housing, new commercial space, new institutional space tied to new transportation systems. It's a very holistic approach, if you will, where you can see the situation today and the situation tomorrow, with new social spaces, new waterfront spaces, open spaces for sports and recreation and parkland, but during flood, these can absorb the flood water. Various amenities, and a number of other instances here that I will click through quickly, but just to give you an impression of how to work at a regional urban scale of planning, but how to bring it all the way down to design, and design that is comprehensive and inclusive of urbanism, of architecture, of infrastructure, integrated with green ecological systems. I'll just flick through these very, very, very quickly now. And finally, it was important to communicate these ideas to the community so that we can get buy-in and people can understand what the project is about. And to do that, we created this vehicle that we could drive from place to place. And we used this vehicle for candy floss and ice cream, but also to give out information and to explain to people, regular people, explain to people what this vision was all about. And this is important, that, you know, as planners and designers, we need to work at a very high level, but we also need to be able to communicate to regular people. We created these sponge baths where people can understand how sponges can absorb water and how you can squeeze water, but how a sponge can also absorb water, and how you can begin to build landscapes that essentially bring water levels down. So there's a very playful and fun and interactive side to this. So I wanted to share this project with you because it is a very good example of thinking at a very, very large scale, at a regional scale, but bringing it all the way down to individual places and to individual people, and to foreground design, and to foreground ambition, and to foreground transformation in a way that we can address some of these issues of 2020, climate, environment, social equity, development, affordable housing, and urbanism more broadly. So we call this soft infrastructure for climate adaptation. The last scheme I'd like to share is very different. This is in Washington, D.C., in the tidal basin, what is called the tidal basin. And around the tidal basin are the significant monuments of Washington, D.C. The Washington Monument, the Jefferson Monument, the FDR Monument, and many others. However, the tidal basin is subject to daily flooding today because it's a very low-lying area and sea level is rising. So many paths and benches around the tidal basin, you can see here, are subject to flooding. And moreover, and this is important, there is political skepticism in climate change. So if we are to address the problems of the tidal basin today, we need to do so by constructing an argument, not simply presenting a design, but presenting an argument as to why this is important. So we begin by looking at Washington, D.C. The tidal basin there is in the middle. You can see the Washington Mall and the Washington Monument, the White House, the US Capitol, and the Potomac River. But what's interesting is that that red outline, you see the red outline there is the outline of Washington, D.C. today with the tidal basin. But you can see how all of this is built on what used to be water, and certainly marshland. You can see the site of the White House and the site of the Capitol sit on higher ground. But you can see that the mall is built on very, very low land. This is Thomas Jefferson's sketch for Washington, D.C. And as Washington, D.C. went under various planning studies, you can see how the low-lying land was originally intended to be a canal and a creek. But in later plans, that began to be covered with parkland. This was an earlier plan to create an English pastoral landscape that later became the more formal landscape of the mall. This is L'Enfant's French Renaissance plan for the National Mall. Two primary axes connecting the White House to the Jefferson Memorial and the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial. So it's a very interesting history where you see the build out of Washington, D.C. over these marshes and wetlands. This was in 1908, and then the tidal basin itself was built around about 1920. Initially as flood infrastructure. And you can see here a map of Washington, D.C. today with the two primary axes. All of the museums and institutions are around the mall and the tidal basin. Variety of roads and bridges. And the two primary landscapes, the mall and the tidal basin. The mall, very formal, axial, grid-like, rectilinear, formal, processional. The tidal basin, more pastoral, romantic. And this contrast between the pastoral and the formal is very vivid. So let's go back to the problem of flooding. With sea level rise, all of this land is subject to significant flooding. You can see here a flood map, and this is today with the 100-year flood and the 500-year flood projections. All of Washington, D.C. is underwater. And indeed, it has already been flooded many times. This was in the 1900s, around about 1926. You see the monuments and sculpture is all totally underwater here. This was more recently, just a few years ago. A massive storm created a flood surge. You see all of the roads and the mall underwater. Cars stuck in torrential floodwaters. Floodwaters coming up into the buildings, into museums and institutions, and flooding the interior buildings. And you can see here more floodwaters affecting the infrastructure of the city. So this is very important and very significant, costing billions of dollars in insurance and in trying to repair. So when we look more closely at the tidal basin itself, you'll see that it's an interesting pastoral configuration. There are many cherry trees around the perimeter, which are very popular in the springtime. Millions of visitors during the month of April, but also very beautiful throughout the year, very beautiful seasonal qualities. The Jefferson Memorial, the FDR Memorial, the Martin Luther King Memorial, and views across the tidal basin to the Washington Memorial. And these all have significant axial and vista relationships, as well as topographical relationships. They're all situated at certain elevations. And when you look at the historical engineering plan, you can see just how low the land is relative to water. And this is the situation today in 2020. During a flood, the entire tidal basin is underwater. And that's only projected to get worse over the next decades, where basically even on a daily tidal cycle, the entire basin will be underwater. And you can see that this impacts the memorials. It impacts the Jefferson Memorial. And this is a scenario, if you will, that if nothing is done, in 2060, the entire basin will simply be a body of water. And so we wanted to paint 3 possible design scenarios working with this. The first one we called curate entropy. And here we're saying, what if we just let it all go? What if we let nature take over? In a sense, this is already happening. There's already places where floods. 3 designs now. And the first one is working with nature, allowing the place to begin to deteriorate as nature takes over. And this is already happening to some degree. You have these edges where water is beginning to slowly encroach into the landscape. There's a project in San Francisco called Alcatraz. It's an old jail, and it has been allowed to become a ruin. And there are other examples of ruins being taken over by nature. And so we thought, what if we were to let the tidal basin be taken over by nature, But we will protect the National Mall. We will build a ring, a circle. The circle will be an earthwork that will protect central Washington, D.C., but the ring will then be an elevated walk around which you could view the changing landscape below. So you see here the geometry of an elevated earthwork and an elevated walk. It brings you out to the river, but it raises you above the landscape that is subject to flooding and subject to change over time. We use this to showcase the monuments, and we overlay this earthwork and structure onto the existing site with a new tree canopy. And you begin to get an illustrative plan like this, where the site is beginning to transition into wetlands and woodlands. But the ring is the new geometrical figure that allows people to still experience and see the site in transition. And at the same time, connects into the National Mall while also protecting it. So you have this elevated walk. It brings you into a new relationship with the monuments. It brings you face to face with some of the monuments. I love this rendition of FDR being allowed to become a ruin with mosses and ferns and beginning to decay over time as nature takes over. And at the same time, being able to absorb and work with daily flooding. And the rest of the landscape begins to transition into marshland. You get rather melancholic, almost dystopian relationship between a landscape that is melancholic, turning to nature, beginning to become totally naturalized, but in the context of Washington, D.C., and even projecting vegetational change over time. These swamp cypresses grow further south, but in 30 or 40 years will easily be growing in a much hotter and more humid Washington, D.C., as the landscape itself begins to transition into something totally different. And the Jefferson Memorial now sits in a swamp. Very poetic and provocative and suggestive and indicative of what might happen if we just let the whole thing go to nature. The second scheme we called Island Archipelago, and said, what happens if we just let the Potomac River fill in the entire basin? But we will build islands to protect the existing monuments. So we'll surround each monument with a series of islands that will protect the monuments, and also build a series of gardens. So again, this is the flood map. This is the diagram of a new flood wall with a series of islands. The islands float in now permanent water, connected with a series of bridges, and topographically constructed as a series of hills and gardens and hollows. And it creates a new topographical landscape, a totally new kind of destination where earthworks and hills and new plantings are creating a totally new global series of gardens within which the monuments can sit. And so what you get is a very pastoral, but also a sort of abstract or dramatic landscape that's topographical with hills. It's not simply a flat landscape. And it's a place where you can journey around from island to island to island with new vistas and new views and new relationships. And I love this view looking across what is now permanently flooded water, looking through the islands to the Washington Memorial. Or across to the Jefferson Memorial. With a beautiful series of plantings and gardens, and the monuments now set in a sense in a much greener kind of landscape. So this was a dramatic scheme, a radical scheme, but again, a provocation and a suggestion of what could be possible. The third and the final scheme is the most practical. It's called protect and preserve. Keep nature out. So here is again the flood map. And the strategy here with the red line is to build a new earthwork that essentially keeps all of the flood water out of the tidal basin and out of the National Mall. So this pushes all of the flood water, all of nature out to the perimeter of the site. It allows for total preservation of the interior. You can see here the geometries of the line work allowing for a raised walk on the earthwork, but also a series of walks and ramps and pathways that connect down to the basin. And this delineates the extent of the work. And because it's an earthwork, we now have interior space, the potential to actually build interiors inside the sculpted earth form. So here you see the overlay of the earthwork onto the site with new vegetation, the preservation of an essentially pastoralized tidal basin, protected by now a significant new landscape investment. It's parkland with new trees and plantings and pathways, offering new amenities and new vista and vantage points, especially across the river, while allowing the historical integrity of the tidal basin to remain. And again, connecting seamlessly into the National Mall. And because we're shaping the earth, we can also shape new balconies and new promontories and new overlooks. These two overlooks, one is looking over the Potomac River, one is looking into the bay. On the Potomac side, we create a new riverfront esplanade with two levels, a lower level that can absorb floods and an upper level. And on the tidal basin side, we have a new building underneath the promontory to service as a new visitor center. And you can see the visitor center, but also the raised overlook above. And that overlook offers great views across to the city. You see this rendering here with the Jefferson Memorial, the new earthwork by the river, new spaces for people to gather and to assemble, to stroll, to sit and to have events. The Jefferson Memorial, and views out to both Jefferson and Washington, and essentially the preservation of the interior. So the first scheme is about letting nature take over, very time-based, melancholic. The second scheme is about a new kind of transformation, that is something totally new, but at the same time retaining the historical attributes of the place. And the third scheme allows for full preservation, full protection, while building a new kind of landscape around the perimeter. And with that, I'll share this 1-minute video animation to end. So, thank you very much. I just wanted to share those two projects as a sort of rethinking or repositioning of what we could be doing as landscape architects, given the situation we've had over the past 10 or 20 years in this world, and where we might be going. So thank you. If there are questions and if we're able to have a discussion, I'm very happy to do that.
James, thank you very much. I want to share with you an applause from the Piacenza location. As you know, we have two different locations, a physical one that is this fantastic former church in the historical city center of Piacenza, as well as all the friends, colleagues, and students are connecting from their own home. We want to thank you very much for this presentation. I'm opening the discussion with colleagues here or at home and with students as well. Opening it, I want just to stress 2 points from your slides, presentation, and topics and questions you have discussed with us. The first one is about the topic of water, because maybe I guess you have never been here in Piacenza, maybe one of the next years without the pandemic. And but Piacenza is a city very close to the main Italian river, the Po River, with a very difficult relationship with the river itself. So now we are here in the historical city center, just 600 meters from the river. It's very difficult to get the river. And this question of flooding, or using water to shape our habitat, our public space and collective space is fantastic, and it is what our students has worked also during the workshop exactly about this topic. And the other question I want to stress, and then we are collecting for sure comments and questions also from the chat. The other question is about options, because you have discussed about how different topic can generate different possibilities. And in a workshop such as the intensive design workshop we have done here in our school, is exactly this the situation. So imagining ideas, imagining scenarios, and then trying to test the scenarios itself. And this is what we have done. And so your final lecture was perfectly on the subject, and we appreciate it. All of us appreciate it a lot. So I'm asking students and colleagues here in our physical location, as well as guests and friends from home, to open the debate. I'm sure we can share maybe 15-20 minutes of discussion with James, and so I'm waiting for you. Otherwise, I can go on and asking some question about our James. I can open it. And I think I have quoted the question of pandemic and how it is changing for sure our ways and kinds of living the space itself. I would like to give you a question or something to discuss about how this situation, in your idea, in your view, is changing the ways to think and to design landscapes itself.
Well, thank you for your remarks. I thought they were spot on. I think with regards to your question, there's no doubt that we're seeing landscape and public space become even more important in cities in particular. You know, green space offers space for people to get out, to have access to just a sense of openness, to a sense of an exposure to nature, and the public dimension. By public dimension, I mean the interactive dimension, where people can be with other people and see other people and participate in urban life, is so critical to the social and quality of life issues in cities today. And the pandemic has only made those kinds of investments more important than ever. Something that I think is becoming very clear, although it also poses a big challenge, is that it's becoming very clear that these spaces need to be quite large. You know, the smaller spaces are great, but it's really the cities that have the large parks, perhaps London with its large network of parks and gardens, or Paris, or New York to a degree, because Central Park and Prospect Park and the Brooklyn River Park are so big that the kinds of investments we need to be looking at in cities have to work at a certain scale. It's not enough to build small parks and small spaces. We need to be looking to be doing bigger things, bigger moves, bigger investments. And again, I think the pandemic is helping people understand the urgency of doing that.
What you have quoted in your presentation to being radical and provocative. Which is the role of radicality and provocation in, well, as well in the design, but also in the teaching of landscape designers? I mean, as the school is doing. Is it a possibility? Well, is it the radicality and the provocation a tool to get better result in landscape design, in your view?
Yeah, I think it's less about being radical and much more about just being bold, being ambitious, thinking out of the box. I think a lot of people come to landscape and urbanism, you know, with a sense of wanting to sort of maintain the status quo. But the medium has a lot more capacity and to do a lot more. And so really the question isn't so much about being radical for the sake of it, but rather to push the potential of landscapes and cities to be so much more, to do so much more. So in terms of teaching, of course, we are encouraging students to think bigger, to try and push certain ideas that might seem very innovative or very experimental, because these are important as a means of seeing just what is possible. At the same time, you want to be able to communicate.
Now we have a question by one student here, Lisana, and then I have seen some hands, maybe Carlotta. I'm giving you the floor later, and Dirk. Okay, now we are waiting for James come back.
Yeah, I'm here, I think.
Okay, hello.
Okay.
Okay, that's fine. We have got anyway your answer. I want to introduce you, Lisana. She's a very brilliant student of our workshop of our school, and she wants to break the ice and give her own question.
Okay.
Hi, James. It's an honor to attend your lecture right now. This is a bit of a stupid and curious question, but I often get this when I try to offer renaturalization works in urban areas to certain clients, let's say. They're always curious about the biotic changes that renaturalization will bring especially into urban areas. So I was curious about how far do you take into consideration like the changes that you make with the recent project that you just presented? How far does a swamp environment fit into the Washington general ecology? That's it. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a good question. New ecologies by default bring new species and new relationships between those species and amongst those species. The case in point in Washington, D.C. is the argument we're trying to make is that a swamp landscape is inevitable. Given we're not making it, it's not like we're creating an artificial landscape, but because of rising heat, rising humidity, all of the ecological landscape that's presently south of Washington, D.C., primarily Florida and the Gulf, that kind of environment is moving north. And so what we're saying is that in 40 or 50 or 60 years, it's sort of an inevitability that you will see these sorts of species changes and the ecological changes that come with that. And I think just to play off your question one more bit, it's very difficult to get people to understand that ecology and nature by default are changing. They're very dynamic systems that inevitably change. You cannot have a static situation in landscape. It is always growing. It's always evolving. New things are coming in. Some things are moving out. And it's part of that I think is lovely and wonderful about landscape. But it's often very difficult to get people to understand that because they kind of like what they have today and they don't want that to change. And the message is change is inevitable.
Interesting.
Lisanne, are you satisfied with the answer?
I was just more curious, I guess, like if you were pushed to answer that question by a certain client, like more than just change is inevitable, like how far do you usually argue for your renaturalization cases?
Well, again, part of the argument would be inevitability. Secondly, you could demonstrate using precedent examples, using examples that show where this has happened in other places. there's the opportunity of using poetics and art as a means of actually painting a picture why this is actually could be a good thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. So the argument could be both scientific and artistic. It could be both drawn from precedents and examples, as well as just the inevitability of change.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Lisana. In our, strange geography, we can jump from Piacenza to Germany, to Dirk from Osnabrück. I give you the floor for questioning James.
Yeah, hello, James. I'm from Germany, from the University of Applied Sciences. Our students took part in this workshop, and we were very happy to have a kind of international cooperation with this workshop. Thank you for the lecture, and I have just two questions. So one is, maybe I don't got it. Who was asking for the proposal for the Washington project? It was a municipality, or it was Mr. Trump? I don't know, because maybe it's important for him because it's his courtyard who is affected, and you use a lot of pictures. And this is the second question. Do you think that these pictures are much more important than the normal plan on the ground level plans and so on? Or is it a kind of possibility to attract the people and stronger power? Because sometimes we landscape architects are only thinking on the normal scale of a plan and hope that people understand this, but you are working with a lot of pictures, and this is really interesting.
Good. Well, thank you for your question. And well, I have very good friends in Germany: Udo Weilacher, and Tilman Latz, Peter Latz. It's a wonderful country with a great landscape tradition. The commission for the tidal basin was actually a sort of a preservation group, an independent preservation group. They see the inevitability of problems in the tidal basin and want to bring it to the consciousness of the politicians. As you know, there's a lot of debate in the US right now as to whether or not climate change is even real. And Trump, you mentioned Trump, is in that camp. I don't think he would support any of our work because he doesn't want to acknowledge that it's important in acknowledging the inevitability of climate change. So it's an interesting situation where you have a group that wants to try to look at the urgency of what the issue is here, but also how to communicate it politically. And that's why we did 3 schemes, because if we're going to talk to politicians, we want to be able to paint a picture of what the scenarios are. And that's why the pictures become important, because they make it immediate. However, I would also say the plans and the diagrams are important too, because those build a solid technical base. I think if you just showed pictures, people would, they might be enchanted, but they would also think that there's a certain naivete, that's naive, it's unrealistic. So by having actually well thought out plans that show all of the engineering dimensions and how things work, you're able to address the feasibility and the realism and the technicality of doing it. So you need both. You need the poetic imagery to compel and to inspire and to provoke the imagination. But you also need the plans so that they can't start pulling your proposal apart on the basis of technical naivete. So it's both. And in this case, it is very political. I mean, we're literally trying to think of ways in which you can persuade, you can change people's minds, you can get them to think and see possibilities in a different way.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, I guess we can go to Milano instead, where I suppose Carlotta Fontana, a colleague of Politecnico di Milano, is, and she asks to give her comments and question. Carlotta.
Hello, everybody. Well, thank you, James, for your splendid presentation. And well, your previous answers were exactly about the topic that I would like to introduce, because I found that the Washington case is very realistic. I mean, it's not provocative, but it's bold because it's based on reality. All the three solutions are visionary, but based on the tragic reality of the things, and that's fine. So I will just add one more little question to the people who talked before me said. What are, generally speaking, the relationship as a firm you have with your, let's say, clients, and especially with the policies and the political level of the work that you do, because this is something that maybe sometimes students don't get very well. So they sometimes they forget that there is this big issue of who decides what happens on the land.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think when you're a student of design, you are learning how to visualize, you're learning about space, you're learning about drawing, you're modeling, you're trying to understand how to think about projects and how to conceive projects and then how to make projects. But yes, you're right. Inevitably, these projects are situated in the world. You have clients, you have communities, you have political issues. And so, and again, I hope this was clear in my presentation, because I tried to show the basis for design work. I didn't just show you the design work. I showed you some of the analysis and tried to tell the story of what the real issues and what the real challenges are behind a project, and therefore why the design makes sense. So embedded in each project is an argument for why the project is relevant, why it is doing what it is doing. It's not just a willful design. It's a design that is beautiful and is striving to have beautiful aesthetic and experiential qualities. But it is also a design that derives and is born from a very close and intelligent reading of what the real problems are, what the real challenges are. And that is what helps you to construct your argument with a client or with a community. You begin by explaining to the client or to the community what the issues are, what the challenges are, what the problems are, and what the opportunities are. And therefore, the design should appear to be a logical and rational extension argument. So my word to the students is, you must learn how to design, you must learn how to approach your projects, but you must also learn how to base your design in real world issues as a means of constructing an argument as to why your design is relevant, why it's important, and why it's worth the kinds of investment that you're expecting the clients and the communities to do.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Take the line, the connection from Piacenza. Marco Maresi is a colleague working here, well, from Piacenza and working here in our campus. I give you the floor for the question.
Thank you. Thank you for the possibility, and thank you for your conference. I want to ask you if you can come back to things that you propose. In the South Bay sponge, clearly you said and you show that you go in the direction of a landscape that is indefined in general, coming from the modernity in which all the things are defined, and now you propose a sort of what we can call a midland landscape, a landscape that is not defined. It's like a place in which water and earth are together. And also in the scenario for the Tidal Basin, the second scenario that you propose, you make the same things. What is different from the third landscape proposed by Gilles Clément? I think in your works is more real. It's not only a general idea, suggestions, something that can inspire, but you need to go in the direction of a world that is the street is not streets and the river is not river. This is the impression of your very interesting work. Thank you for the answer.
I'm not sure I understood the question. I'm sorry. I think you were suggesting that some of the way in which landscape is treated, you're saying is undefined, as if there's a lack of geometry or formality. And I would agree that there are some types of landscape that have that quality of non-definition, and in particular wetlands and marshes and natural landscapes have that quality because they're different every hour of every day. They're a little bit wetter, or they're a little bit drier, or the atmosphere is different in terms of whether it's misty or clear or raining. So yes, on the one hand, there are these what you would call undefined, non-formal or informal landscapes that are subject to natural processes. And let's just say wetlands, marshes, woodlands are in that typology. But there's also other types of landscape where there is a precision, a formal precision, whether that's curvilinear or rectilinear. For example, I think the tidal basin schemes, they all have an incredible level of precision and detail in terms of how certain parts of the landscape are made and constructed and shaped. I mean, you know, as designers, you spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about the geometry, about the curve. Should it curve more? Should it curve less? Should it reach out across the water? Should it stay inboard? Should it be lifted higher? Should it be dropped lower? You know, you're continually modeling or sculpting the forming and the shaping of certain types of landscape. So if I understood your remarks correctly, I think that we do need to recognize the inevitability of these two types of landscape. One is the informal, the undefined, the naturalized, and the other is the made, the constructed, where geometry and materiality and a certain degree of fixity is important. And again, I hope that that was self-evident in particular in the tidal basin landscapes. Did I answer your question satisfactorily?
Yes, I wanted to stress you about these specific things, and it's interesting because you say that also what we apparently see like undefined really is a long time of design. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Now maybe I would like to stress this point. Maybe undefined means also to give a new role to the nature itself, isn't it? Is my question.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So we have also discussed about this undefinition of the landscape. That sounds like a very topical question. Before giving the floor to our director, Sara Protasoni, for closing the session, I want just to, instead to give maybe a very trivial and banal question. In our workshop, we have worked from many different parts of the world with these strange geographies. We were here in Vicenza more Chinese students than Italian students, because maybe Italian students were in some other parts of Europe, and so this changing of dimension. Some of the students have worked about some topics without seeing the place because they cannot travel. You have the luck and the opportunity to work with such large scale landscape design in all over the world, in different parts of the world. Is it changing your approach when you are in Western countries, in other countries, or maybe in Europe or in Italy? I mean, how is the today? How is the origin and the sites in terms of culture impacting on your design processes?
So thank you for your question. I think it's an extraordinarily important question because we do work in different places, and different places have different ecologies, they have different climates, they have different topographies, different materialities, a different feeling, different characteristics. But secondly, they have different cultures. I mean, people are different in different cities. Even in the United States, working in Seattle is very different than from working in New York. Local culture is different. And I know this is true in Europe, even in Italy. I know there's a difference between the south of Italy and the north of Italy, and people who are in the interior versus people who are on the coast. So your point is very important. And I think we need to hone and sharpen our skills for being very receptive to the places we work in. What that means is spending some time in a place physically, experiencing it, meeting people, having a meal with people, understanding who these people are, and to try to come as close as you can to understanding what's important to them and how they see the world. And this is a very important beginning to how you then approach the design work. We try never to just turn up somewhere with some great design. I think that that's arrogant. I don't think that design makes any sense necessarily. I think you have to try to build your design concept out of the foundations of the place itself. So I think your question is good, it's important, it's challenging, it's very difficult, but it has to be done.
Okay, thank you for the answer and the discussion. I'm giving the floor to Sarah for thanking and closing. Or question, I don't know.
No. So we are, yeah, we are at the end. I really want to thank James Corner for his contribution, which was, as we expected, very, very inspiring. Also in relation of the work we have done in these weeks that we have seen before. I think all our students here and also online have the possibility to appreciate a lot your references and also your reflections. And so I think now we can close saying hello and hoping that we can in the future organize something in presence. Maybe you come to Italy and you can to our place.
Can I?
You have to sit at the desk
Sarah,
with us.
Sarah,
Valerio is also here. Ciao, Valerio.
can I say
Yes,
a
and now I
few
give the floor to
words?
Valerio for the final greetings. Thank you. Bye.
Fine. I don't know. I would like to say a few words, saying it was a big pleasure and honor to be a friend of James Corner. We met when he decided to invite me the first time to teach at Penn. He was a great professor. When I met him, he was dedicated to the school and he was able to deal with new programs and new ideas, process and so on. And I learned a lot when I met him, and we had a lot of discussions during dinners, fighting about many different interests and ideas. So he took joke of me many times. I tried to react many times, but it was difficult. But I think what I really learned from Jim, and I think it is a very important lesson for all the students, is that he is able to deal with exactitude. Calvino called it one of his essay, exactitude, precision, with poetic, with inventions, with imagination and creativity. And that was the most important lesson I learned from him, and it is easier to see this in all his works. So I would like to take 2 minutes to say this to my friend Jim, and I will miss you. No, we have to do something to come for me to come back to United States, or you have to come to Italy and stay with us in Piacenza. In Piacenza the food is very good, so you can stay in Piacenza and having a very good food. Okay, thanks a
Valerio,
lot.
if Trump gets another term, I will move to Italy to be with.
No, my friend. No. For even you stay in United States. You stay in United States. Don't come here to invade Italy. Stay with Trump and and be friend of him at least.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, Jim. Bye.
Bye. Bye.